Welcome to the first video lecture for the U.S. Arizona Government class. What we're going to do in this lecture, if we can get the camera to work appropriately, is go through some of the basics of what sets up a government class. And again, I'm going to have you learn some terminology here. I'm going to have you look at a couple of different factors that go along with what brought governments about and kind of set the tone for the rest of this course. Now, why are you taking a course on government? Well, you're required to, right? But why? I mean, aren't social studies classes the most boring classes that are out there? I mean, that's certainly what a lot of students have come into my classroom telling me. That's certainly what a lot of them thought coming in. Well, first of all, my hope is that by the end of this class, you're not going to be like this gentleman right here. You're going to actually be awake, and you're going to think that this is much more exciting. But much more than exciting is that it's important. It's important because government does affect your life. There's no way around it. If you're living here, something's going to happen, tax-wise, hopefully not draft-wise, but you never know. Things happen that are going to affect your life. Now, as a senior, which is typically when people in Arizona take this class, it's a required course, which is a good time. You know, why not freshman is a question I would normally ask a classroom. It's not going to apply as much. As a senior, you may be old enough to vote. If not, you're close. It's a good time to be studying this stuff. So again, I love teaching this class because I feel it has a big relevance to the life of people out there. There's definitely courses in high school when I was a student I felt like, why does this matter? Is this going to apply to me in life? This does, and let me start to explain. Now, step number one, why do we even have governments? You certainly hear people complain about it a lot. You certainly hear people say that they do terrible, horrible things. And in this class, we'll look at the positive things government has done, and certainly we'll look at some of the negative things government has done. But what about the full extreme no government? What do you call that? First term, you need to know it. It's called the state of nature. State of nature is, again, life without government. Now, what are the ups and downs to living in something like the state of nature? Well, the positive, complete and utter freedom. You can do whatever you want. There's no government there. There's no law. You can do whatever you would like. The negative, complete and utter vulnerability. There's no one there to enforce rules. There's no one there to protect you and keep you safe. It's all on you. That's the concept of the state of nature, which is why people choose not to live in it. And regardless of where you are around the world, there's some type of culture that comes together in a community to form some type of either family or government bond to be able to protect against this. The school analogy that I always give, as a teacher, if I were to hand out a test, and then the very first thing I did is I left the room. Students know the rules. They know that they should take the test honestly. They know that they're not supposed to cheat off other people because it is an assessment of knowledge. But if a teacher isn't there, let's be honest, will some students cheat? I'm not going to say all students cheat. Of course some won't cheat, but some will. You do need a figure there to enforce rules. You do need a figure there to make sure that things go according to plan and that it is fair and equitable. That's why governments exist. Now, in this class, we're going to look at the wide variety of different governments that are out there. We, of course, live in a democracy in the United States, and rule by the people is the root of that. Now, what are the other ones you can live in? Well, we're going to look at a theocracy in the way that that is. Now, I've chosen some dramatic images behind me from the country of Iran, which is a theocracy in the modern world, which means rule by religion, and you have to go along with that government's one interpretation of that religious principle and belief. As you can see for the people in Iran, it's not working out well for some. If you are somebody that thinks outside the box and you're going to challenge authority, theocracies are tough to live in. If you're a person that thinks outside the box and you like to challenge authority, democracy is the place for you because that's where you get to voice your, way that you want to see things. Now, beyond something like Iran, United States. So what are the differences? I like to draw parallels between the way people live around the world and the way that we live here. Give you a very extreme example of what you can get away with here in the United States. There's an organization in the U.S. known as PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And when I was a college student at Arizona State University, this organization showed up and put these two images up. The one is chickens being slaughtered for Kentucky Fried Chicken. The other is a picture of mass extermination from the Holocaust during World War II. The organization was equating the two, saying that what is happening to chickens today is equal to what happened to people in the Holocaust during World War II. Now, I'd normally in a classroom situation throw it out to get a little bit of feedback, so I will let you contemplate that concept for just a second. And moving on, one of the things that I like to point out is, agree with it or not, do they have the freedom to say something like this here in the United States? Of course they did. They came with a whole big display to Arizona State. For argument's sake, say I had the freedom to sit front row and eat Chick-fil-A. Not saying I did that. But do I have the right to sit front row eating Chick-fil-A watching this presentation? Of course I do. That's part of the way we live. We have those freedoms. Now, that also brings a set of challenges, having that much freedom when it comes to speech in this country. One of the organizations we'll look at in this class is the Westboro Baptist Church, that's made not only a lot of waves and controversy, but also a Supreme Court case, Snyder v. Phelps, that we will look at later in this class to talk about the rights of what you can or cannot do. If you're unfamiliar with Westboro Baptist, this is a small organization that travels the United States to protest the U.S. government, and they will normally protest at high-profile or even low-profile funerals for soldiers that have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they put up signs like you can see behind me. God blew up the troops. Thank God for IEDs, which are the bombs that killed many soldiers over in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, this is the minority, but they also bring up a really interesting First Amendment challenge, which is, can you actually do this? Well, the Supreme Court actually already looked at this case. We'll talk about that in this class. One thing I want you to notice: the current events are definitely what I will be presenting in this class. So we're going to kind of have you thinking about what is currently going on. Now, coming from an election year to be very high during those times, people are very extreme these days. You see lots of arguments for and against people, thinking that one is the savior and the other is almost the Antichrist. But the fact is that this political culture that we have here in the United States definitely affects policy, it definitely affects things, even though you have these extremes that don't necessarily run the show. Now, thinking of it from, let's say, a college level for a second, let's kind of look past the high school realm of things and get it to that other bigger level. Politics is studied as a science. Political science is a degree that you can take if you're interested, and it's because people who have come up with these theories say that there are formulas. They're dynamic, they don't stay the same, but they are formulas that if you can crack the code, you can understand how people are going to vote, you can understand how people are going to behave simply by looking at some data and simply by looking at patterns that have existed in the past. You know, for degrees in college, you have this difference between arts and science. In art, obviously, we can disagree on whether it's good art, whether it is something that is a wonderful work that is a benefit to society as a whole, or if it's a piece of garbage. Science, whole different thing. If I'm using a chemical compound and I know that compound's formula, there's no arguing it. That's what it is. In politics, many argue that it falls under the scientific realm, not the artistic. It's not up to interpretation. So to tell you how that works, so a president who wins re-election, I can pose the question, why? Now there's going to be a lot of debate on something like that. How did Barack Obama win re-election in 2012? But here's the simple fact. If you look at it from a political scientist standpoint, he cracked the code. He knew the formula to campaign appropriately, to get people on his side, to enact policy in his 4 years as president, to convince people to vote for him again. It isn't that he's somehow good or bad. That's irrelevant. It's that he knew the code. He knew the combination. He knew the formula to get people to vote for him. This class is about being that thinker, taking that emotion and setting it aside. We've got enough emotion in government these days. Let's set that aside and look at some things. So when we look at these issues and we talk about them in a more political science realm, we're not asking about issues that are right and wrong. It's about constitutional versus unconstitutional. I'll give you an example. Let's go back to the Snyder v. Phelps thing. Holding signs up at a funeral for somebody who died for their country over in Iraq or Afghanistan. Is this right or wrong? Doesn't matter. Is it constitutional is the question. And of course, this one has already been settled in the courts. Yes, it is. You do have the freedom to do that in this country. Issues that are big in government these days. The concept of, will you legalize gay marriage? Is it right or wrong? Up for debate. Is it constitutional? That's what we need to look at. And as far as that goes, that's being decided right now. Interesting time to be alive, to look at those things. Coming to you from Arizona here. We tend to be the center of controversy in many, many things. Illegal immigration issues. Was Arizona trying to pass SB 1070, which was a piece of legislation that would outlaw being here and even knowing somebody was here if they were illegal? There's a lot of controversy over this. Should cops be allowed to pull people over and look for their documentation? Should the state of Arizona be able to deport on its own? All these things came up. Now, is this right or wrong? Doesn't matter. Is it constitutional? And as many of the federal courts have already said, including the Supreme Court now, most of what happened in SB 1070 is not constitutional. Some of it is, but at the same time, there's a part of the Constitution that says the federal government has to deal with immigration issues. It's about being that kind of thinker in this course. Now, the other thing we'll look at, too, is how do wars affect it? We've obviously lived through a time of war in the past decade. How much does war affect things? Now, the image on the left is the Gaza Strip, and we think about wars like that. It's over in Israel, the Middle East, and some places around the world. The picture on the right is New York City, the World Trade Center. Wars come home very recently to us here in the United States, and what we are looking for is how did our government change out of that? So in this class, we'll be talking about the Patriot Act, we'll be talking about some of the new legislation, possible debates on encroachments of civil liberties. And again, the concept is to get you to think. I like to use quotes, I like to go to the past. I am a social studies teacher after all, and one of the things I always go back to at this point is what John F. Kennedy said back in the day, where he said, "Too often people enjoy the ease of opinion without the frustration of thought." Think about that. In other words, very easy to have an opinion, very easy to know what you believe, but do you know why you believe it? This class is about kind of challenging those things. It's not about making you think one thing or the other. It's about knowing why you believe something. That's what a thinker does. Now let's start with the presidency. Is he the end-all be-all to power in the United States, or is it us as the people, since we have the option of voting him out? At least we did not that long ago. We'll see. But the next three terms that you do need to understand about our government and the way that it works is that there are three basic government powers all governments have. We just have separated them out into branches. Now the three basic powers are the executive, legislative, and judicial powers of government. Basic definitions. Legislative power is the power to create law. Executive power is the power to enforce the law. And the judicial power is the power to interpret the law. Now, how these are combined together determine what type of government you have. We've separated them out, and we allow people to choose who goes into a couple of these branches. That's kind of the background of a democracy. If you have one individual that holds all of these powers by himself, what would you call it? Dictatorship. You got it. That's kind of how we start to look at things here. Now, there's four theories that you need to know about how governments come about, how these powers are organized. So I'll go and give you an example for each. I'll go slow and give you an example for each. The first is the force theory. Force theory means government comes about because somebody forces you to follow them. Now, I use Saddam Hussein as a good example because for a long time he definitely had a government that ran as a force theory. You had to follow him because he said so, and he had the power to kind of make people go along with that for a period of time. Those governments don't last. The clock is always ticking on those. Now, other types of governments, the next one is called the evolutionary theory. I use Africa as an example because in Africa there's still a lot of tribal connections that go through there. The evolutionary theory, think of it as like a family. You have not necessarily a government per se, but you have a tribe, a group that works together, and it's kind of a family unit. The government provides for people because you are part of the same collective family or community. That's how a lot of this continent operates. So evolutionary theory is there, but as globalization has set in, definitely you have more and more groups coming together that you may not consider your family, but you still got to live together. We'll get to that one. Third one is the divine right theory. Divine right theory, why am I in charge? God said so. That's the concept behind the divine right theory. Once again, those tend not to last very long. Taliban in Afghanistan, good example. They put themselves in charge in the late 90s. They definitely said that they had the way to do things because that's how God said that they should be doing things, and you can't argue with that. I mean, at least from their perspective, you can't argue with that if you were living there. Once again, those tend not to last. The fourth is called the social contract theory that was brought about by this gentleman named Rousseau behind me, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Came up with this concept out of France many years ago, and the social contract theory is where we are in the United States. Social contract is this simple. Groups, diverse groups, work together to come up with an agreement for how you live in a society. Once again, diverse groups come up with an agreement for how you will live in a society. And this is where we have our Constitution, which is our social contract that is set out the foundation of law and the rules and guidelines for the United States. Later in this class, we're going to talk about the influences into that of independence. Even that document went into the current Constitution, and about the way that it has changed our role. Ben Franklin also gave us a good cartoon back in the day too, which said join or die. And that it's not just these rules and set up for, like, you know, in one state and one group, but it's multiple different states that are together. And again, these are our different tribes, if you will, because definitely in the first part of the United States history, people thought of themselves more from New York or from Virginia than they did from the United States. But our social contract says you got to work together. You've got to figure these things out, and you've got to be one. We'll talk about the evolution of that concept as we go. Now, some of the jobs government does. A couple basic things to keep in mind. One of the things government is basically tasked to do is protect us from ourselves. Again, another dramatic image, but I'm trying to keep attention here. Car crashes. Why do we have speed limits? Well, because if we didn't, do you think more things like this would probably happen? Why do we have laws against, all the things that we have in life? Why can't you say anything you want to say to a police officer or threaten a president or anything like that? Because there are restrictions. We have to be saved from ourselves sometimes. Again, I use this as an example. And of course, if part one of a government's job is to protect us from others, part two is to protect, or if part one is to protect from ourselves, part two is to protect from others. And once again, we live in a time where that wasn't that long ago, where something like that happened, where we really are still in that post 9/11 mindset of rules that need to be changed to kind of protect us from others that are out there. Which job is more challenging? It's up for debate. It's a tough job, though. Got to give them that. Now, third job that a government is going to want to provide is a standard of living. Now again, I use this image as an example, and I usually start a class discussion after it, so I'm going to have to kind of tell you how this goes. But this is an image I took when I was in Central America years ago, if you can see it there. There's two people, and I always ask my class to ignore skin color, and I ask which is from the United States. The obvious answer is the one on the left. And the answer is because you've got shoes, you've got a backpack, you've got a bag, and that was how when I was down in this place where people didn't have much. Our standard of living here in the United States, I really learned how good it is compared to others in the world. The little young man that was walking with us here was not walking barefoot because he was just too lazy to put shoes on. He did not have them. And yet us gringos, as we were going around, we had the food, we had the water, we had the bug repellent, we had the sunblock, we had all those things, and yet we were told when we lived down here with these people, we had to live like they did. We were expected and asked to that if we're going to eat, we have to have enough to share. If we're going to drink, we have to have enough to share. So what does that mean if you're in a group of 25 people and you're down to one energy bar that you got left? You break it into 25 pieces. What's that look like? It's about the size of my pinky, just the top of it. Is it filling? No. Is that what you do to survive if you live down there? Yeah. Our government upholds our standard of living. Their government down there doesn't provide that much of a standard of living. They're kind of really on their own. But that's part of the United States. I mean, our electricity is subsidized by the government. Our water is pretty much brought to us by our local governments. There are some basic necessities of life. Us here in Arizona, we only survive because of a project called the Central Arizona Project that brings water in. It was a federal initiative. They uphold our standard of living. Now, a lot of people like to say in class, do we have the best standard of living? Well, we certainly did at one point. No longer. We're in one of those transition periods that are going back and forth. In the 1600s it was the Dutch, in the 1700s it was the Spanish, 1800s it was the British. 1900s is definitely our time to shine, but we're not in the 1900s anymore. So where's it shifting to? Where do you think it's shifting to? Most people see where the economy is shifting around the world. Southeast Asia is definitely where a lot of things are happening there. And kind of the joke I always like to point out in class is this. A gentleman by the name of Bill Gates spoke at a place over in India years ago, and they had such a large crowd show up that some people compared it to a Britney Spears concert. So what's that say for us here in America, where Bill Gates can give a speech and he's definitely not going to get that kind of crowd? When in India, Bill Gates is Britney Spears, and in America, Britney Spears, well, I guess it's not as much Britney Spears anymore. It's probably Lady Gaga or whatever new is out there. Regardless, when that happens, you can see where the education, the investment, all that is shifting around the world. Now in America, we've definitely enjoyed our ride. Are we going to keep it? It's up for modern debate. We've definitely enjoyed our liberty. Potentially too much? Who knows? That's up for debate. All I know is that we definitely have a lot of freedoms in this country. We definitely have a lot of these things that have set us on our course, and they are now comparing ourselves with others that are around the world. That's it for Lecture 1, looking into United States government. More so in the next lecture.